Hello, my friends, and welcome to the catchily named Problem of Suffering and Evil Part 3, here in the Curate Study, on this, our Wondering Wednesday. So if you've managed to stick with us so far, well done you, because it's been quite a lengthy and complicated ride. Before we start, as with all of these particular series, a health warning. I understand that the world is complicated and people's individual lives are often full of difficulty and sometimes suffering. So nothing I say here is meant to detract from your personal situation or something that's happening in the life of someone you love. And actually, in all likelihood, I'm not going to be able to provide you with answers or even a general answer as to why God might allow suffering in the world. This is really an opportunity for us to think together and run through a list of questions, a sort of a thought-provoking exercise, if you will. So, in the previous two episodes, we've tried to define terms as to what evil might be, what suffering might be, and we've discussed the fact that roughly evil is split into two halves, or two groups, if you will: moral evil and natural evil. Moral evil, that being the evil that human beings do, and natural evil, the evil that sort of just happens to us, like the virus that's spreading around the world as we speak. So let's get right into it. Why might a good God allow these dreadful things to happen? And let's start with moral evil, the things that we human beings do. Now, surely God could just stop us from being able to harm each other. We all know that God created human beings and gave us the ability to exercise free will. So obviously that means we have the choice whether to do good things or bad things, in its simplest term. And the alternative would be to remove our ability to make those choices, or certainly to limit them quite strongly. And so therefore, in a roundabout way, just designing evil out of the system in which we exist. But I can't help wondering where he would start with that. I mean, perhaps violence is the obvious first contender to be removed from our ability to make choices over. We could simply, by removing the ability for human beings to use physical force against each other, wars would stop, fights, assaults, and so many other violent crimes. It would also probably affect things like some sports, things like boxing and rugby. But how would that play out in the world, for example? So what if police officers could no longer use physical force? How would that work? Or when force is required to stop an individual from hurting themselves or from hurting an animal, say, for example. I mean, the only way a police officer could operate in a civilized society without the use of force would be if God made it impossible for us to commit any crimes. And that actually doesn't sound like a bad thing, does it really? If God simply, with the click of his fingers, stopped all human beings from being able to break the law, those things that society broadly agrees are wrong. Well, leaving aside the fact, of course, that there would have to be different rules for different people in different countries and different cultures who consider different things to be wrong. Also, God would need to constantly modify that commandment or that rule that he'd imposed upon human nature as society changes its view on what should and shouldn't be illegal. And then, of course, that wouldn't prevent some of the other forms of suffering, which we might feel that are not actually as a result of evil, but are as a result of human action. So what about unrequited love, say, for example, and the heartbreak that that causes? What if you love someone, but they don't love you, or they no longer love you? Would we think it would be right for God to choose who we love and how we love? And would that be love at all? What about simple competition in the world? What about a job interview that you don't get the role for, which causes you stress and suffering? What about a young person who decides to pursue a career abroad, leaving an elderly and lonely parent? Would we want our choices in not just in love, but in who we choose for a job, or where we decide to go to work, or a whole range of other things that potentially cause suffering to those that we love, to be curtailed because God stops us from being able to make those free choices? And that's before we move on to actions by individuals that cause suffering to themselves. because there are vast numbers of people whose lifestyle choices accidentally or deliberately cause them self-suffering. Drug addicts, for example, or alcoholics. Now, we might agree actually that God should remove both of those self-damaging habits or behaviours. That doesn't sound too bad at all. But then what about people who smoke? Or what about people whose diet causes them to be susceptible to diabetes or heart disease? Those people who might enjoy gambling a bit too much or have a sex addiction? What about those people who engage in risky, unprotected sex, which can result in disease or unwanted pregnancy? What about abortion? What about those people who undertake dangerous sports, who actually which may not cause them suffering, but actually might cause a great deal of anxiety amongst those people who love them and worry about their safety? Then, if we look at other types of self-inflicted suffering of sorts, what about those people who take pleasure in exercise, but actually over-exercise perhaps and damage themselves? Should God control or stop all these sorts of risky behaviours or behaviours which might cause suffering, either now or in the future? And what about then those actions which, without our knowledge, indirectly cause suffering to others? The parent not phoned on a birthday, or an unkind word spoken accidentally. Does it matter if we don't realise our actions are causing suffering? And does it matter if our actions are going to cause suffering a long way away, or at 10, 15 or 20 years in the future? Now, I appreciate that some of these are trite examples, and yes, of course they are, but where does the sliding scale begin and end on how and when and for who God would interfere to limit our choices, particularly when we consider that what causes you suffering might not cause me suffering, and vice versa? How long would God allow the duration of any suffering to be, and to what extent would he limit it? It's difficult stuff, isn't it? Now, moving on from that to the problem of natural evil, we might think, now this is far simpler, because why would God have created a world in which so many dangers, both real and imagined, exist? We've only got to look at things like tsunamis, or viruses, or cancer. So this stuff isn't governed by our free will. Surely this is entirely God's responsibility. Well, yes and no. Of course, the natural world is full of dangers, and many of them we have absolutely no choice over how and when they strike. But in many cases, we must certainly take some responsibility for the outworking of those natural disasters in the world. Let's take famines, for example, that sudden and unexpected loss of a whole region or nation's food supply, causing massive suffering and often untold death. But you see, the truth of the matter is, the world produces far more food than actually we need, several times over in fact, and there is sufficient infrastructure around the world to move that food to wherever it is needed in fairly short order. So in reality, if there is no such thing as a completely natural famine today. If people go without food, it is purely because that internationally there is not the political will to make sure that does not happen. Often we just don't choose to stop it from happening, or at least we choose to ignore the effects of it. And the same goes for millions of people who die all over the world because of a lack of clean water or soap, or cheap and readily available medicine, and so on, while we in the West look away. But what about those diseases with no cure, we might say? What about cancer, particularly a child suffering from cancer? But the bitter truth is, of course, that what is a priority in our society is entirely down to us. So if we funded hospitals like we fund football clubs and football stars, I wonder how much further we would be on in the fight against cancer. One of the things the C19 virus has revealed is the fundamental lies that lie at the heart of how we often live our lives. So we've just experienced, in this country at least, a prolonged period of austerity, haven't we? Which has meant massive cuts to the NHS and to social services, things like children's mental health and social care, for example. And these have undoubtedly resulted in colossal suffering and probably quite a few deaths as well, or certainly quite a few premature deaths. And this has come just after we found vast amounts of money to bail out the British banking system. What if we treated cancer like this virus? What if 20 years ago we decided to have a war on cancer as a society? I wonder how much further we would be on with treatments or possibly with a cure. And there's another frightening fact. More people kill themselves now than are killed in global conflicts. Imagine that. What does that tell us about the way our world has transitioned from one series of problems to another? Natural evil exists. That is a hard truth that we theists, we believers in God, have to grapple with. But we are certainly guilty as a species for complicity in natural evil's death toll, aren't we? So maybe the question we should be asking here is, should God stop that? Is our species' willful blindness actually an evil act? And if it is, should God stop it? And here are a few things to consider as far as general principles are concerned. If there was no suffering, there would be no such thing as bravery. If there was no suffering, there would never be any hardship to overcome or struggle. And how would we have developed as a species in a world in which no evil or suffering existed? And finally, for all its awfulness and pain, maybe the reason a good God allows suffering is because a world with suffering is the best possible choice for what prepares us for what is to come. Maybe it's a world that allows us the opportunity to strive to become more Christ-like against terrible odds and temptations. But in conclusion, I'm forced to accept that I don't know for certain why God allows evil to exist. I can imagine all kinds of possible reasons. The questions I've raised here are just a few of the ones that I've grappled with. But I still understand that when I'm actually going through it myself, or when I'm sitting with somebody who's suffering, or with a family who's bereaved, none of them seem entirely satisfactory. But in a curious way, this doesn't destroy my belief in God. Because the fact that the suffering and the grief and the pain just feels wrong deep in here makes me appreciate that this is not the way it's supposed to be. That actually this is just unfair. And there's a curious thing I can't help noticing, is that although some people would claim to believe that there is no God, and would claim to believe that the universe is just a cold and uncaring place, we don't live like it, do we? We don't actually just accept that. We really do feel that this isn't fair, and there should be justice in the world, and evil and suffering should be stopped. We want fairness and an end to the suffering. That's not just a full stop, but is a doorway to something better, isn't it? And what gives me great comfort is the God that I believe in did the one thing that seemed to be impossible for an omnipotent and good God. He limited himself to human flesh, and in doing so, he experienced all of the worst suffering anyone could experience. So maybe, at the end of the day, all I can do is accept that God asks nothing of me that he's not done himself. And maybe that gives him the ultimate qualification to judge why a good God might allow evil and suffering to happen. I hope you found my musings and wonderings useful. Next week we're going to move on to something different. I don't entirely know what yet. Maybe you'd like to email me and come up with a suggestion of something we might like to consider at fromthecuratestudy@gmail.com. But in the meantime, no matter what your life is looking like, good or bad or indifferent, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. God bless, my friends. Goodbye.